In the dimly lit chambers of the dark castle, a young woman cowered in the farthest corner of the room, desperately trying to distance herself from the man approaching her. His sword, dripping with the blood of the guards he had ruthlessly slain, seemed to mirror the dark intent in his eyes. As he drew nearer, she recoiled in fear, her voice trembling as she asked him why he was committing such horrific acts. The man merely smiled, a chilling expression devoid of warmth, and replied that it was all because she was still alive. His words twisted cruelly as he referred to her as his mother, though he quickly corrected himself, choosing instead to call her the former empress. With an evil grin, he raised his sword and, without a moment's hesitation, struck her down, his gaze cold and unflinching as her lifeless body collapsed to the ground. As the man, whose name was Yuri, turned to leave, something unexpected transpired. The woman's soul seemed to separate from her body, and she found herself gazing upon the scene from a detached perspective. She realized with horror that she was indeed dead. Yet, as she looked at Yuri, she saw the deep pain etched on his face, tears streaming down as he grappled with the weight of his actions. Despite the pain he had caused her, the woman's heart ached for him. She floated closer to him, her ghostly form trembling as she wept and whispered apologies, begging for forgiveness. She hadn't intended for their lives to unravel this way. But as she reached out to him, her surroundings began to glow, and she felt herself slowly disintegrating, her spirit fading. Panic surged within her as she pleaded for more time, desperate not to leave Yuri alone in his torment. She knew she had to make things right, to heal the wounds she had unintentionally inflicted upon him. Suddenly, she closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she was no longer in the castle. She awoke with a start, screaming Yuri's name, only to find herself in an unfamiliar room. Disoriented and frightened, she glanced around frantically, trying to understand where she was. Her gaze fell upon a diary lying on a nearby table. She grabbed it and, flipping through the pages, discovered that it was dated 10 years in the past. The realization struck her like lightning, she had somehow traveled back in time. Surprised yet resolute, she set the diary aside, determined to seize this second chance. She had to make things right, to prevent the future she had witnessed from ever coming to pass. As the daughter of a baron, she had faced scorn and rejection daily, especially after giving birth to Yuri. Her husband, the emperor, was rarely home, always off on military campaigns, leaving her isolated and yearning for companionship. When Yuri was born, she had felt an immense joy, believing that she would no longer be alone. But her hopes were dashed when the emperor coldly took the newborn away, thanking her for fulfilling her duty and stating that her role was now over. His words stung, and as his mother entered the room to discuss something with him, the girl, still weak from childbirth, was left in shock and confusion. The emperor left her in the hands of an education officer, and as he departed, she looked at her sleeping son, refusing to believe that this would be their last moment together. Cradling the baby in her arms, she gently rocked him, desperately hoping to keep him close. But her hope was short-lived. A stern woman approached, demanding that she hand over the child. Fear gripped her, and she vehemently refused, holding her son even tighter. The woman, surprised by her defiance, asked harshly what she could possibly offer the child, given her lack of status and resources. The girl, undeterred, insisted that as his birth mother, she had every right to raise him and would do everything in her power to ensure his happiness. The stranger conceded that she would not dispute the fact, acknowledging she had indeed fulfilled her duty admirably by providing an heir. However, the emperor had already informed her that she had done everything necessary. At that moment, the child sensed the tense atmosphere in the room and began to cry. The girl hurried to soothe him, but the woman abruptly snatched the child from her arms. She coldly remarked that this was not a mere suggestion from an outsider but a direct order from the emperor, leaving no room for disobedience. The maids present in the room began to whisper and laugh amongst themselves. One maid commented that the emperor's wife, who hailed from a baron's family, was incapable of even fulfilling the basic duty of caring for the crown prince. The girl, overwhelmed by the realization of her powerlessness in the situation, could only feel deep regret. From that moment on, she was barred from seeing Yuri except during official functions. The child, destined to be the crown prince, would grow up isolated from his birth mother, and in a tragic twist of fate, her first life ended with her own son being the one to take it. But now, the girl was determined not to repeat the same mistakes in this life. She resolved to alter her fate entirely. Upon awakening, she immediately rushed to one of the rooms, banging on the door and demanding to be let in and reunited with Yuri. The guards stationed at the door tried to calm her, urging her to stop, warning that her actions would only make matters worse. They reminded her repeatedly that they had strict orders not to allow her in, nor to let Yuri out. But the girl was resolute. She insisted that as the Empress, she had every right to see the Crown Prince, her son, and that no one could forbid it. The guards were taken aback by her words. Realizing the gravity of the situation and having no other choice, one of them reluctantly opened the door, allowing the Empress to enter. She swiftly made her way inside, where she found a young boy peeking out from around the corner, curiously watching the commotion. It was Yuri, drawn by the shouting. When he saw the woman, he looked at her in disbelief and asked if she was truly his mother. They stared at each other for a moment before the woman, unable to contain herself any longer, ran to him, crying as she embraced him tightly. The guards, witnessing this, were astonished. They could hardly believe the sincerity of her actions. Yuri, feeling his mother's genuine concern, was initially alarmed and asked what had happened and why she was there. The Empress continued to hold him, gazing into his beautiful ruby-colored eyes, and simply said that she had wanted to see him. In her past life, a person of her status speaking to the Crown Prince was considered a grave insult to the imperial family. Fearing judgment from others, she had resigned herself to living apart from her son. But now, she fully understood the enormity of that mistake, which had led to such devastating consequences. In the end, she had died by the hand of the very son she loved so dearly, but from whom circumstances had kept her apart. This time, however, she vowed never to let go. She would stay by Yuri's side and raise him, no matter the cost. As she held the boy, calling him her dear son, Yuri was initially surprised and resistant, but soon he softened in her embrace, feeling an unexpected warmth. Despite what anyone else might say, she was determined to make her son happy in this life. Suddenly, lost in her thoughts, she began to hug him even more tightly, almost suffocating him. Yuri, struggling to breathe, gently asked her to loosen her grip, and she immediately did so, apologizing for getting carried away. He reassured her that it was all right, but his face remained troubled. Concerned, she asked what was bothering him, and Yuri, with tears in his eyes, lowered his head and asked why she had never replied to his letter. The girl was taken aback and asked what letter he was referring to, as she knew nothing of it. Hearing this, Yuri became even more upset, feeling heartbroken that his mother, for whom he had worked so hard to write a letter, had not even remembered him. The Empress was on the verge of protesting that she had received nothing, but before she could speak, the maids who had been caring for the boy appeared, their faces filled with indignation at the sight of her. One of the maids immediately addressed Her Majesty, sternly requesting that she leave at once. Another maid began to escort Yuri away, telling him that his head tutor, Miss Adelaide, would return shortly, and that he should wait for her in his room. In the end, the Empress found herself separated from her son, and she could scarcely believe what was happening. The door closed behind Yuri and the maid, leaving her standing on the opposite side, utterly cut off from her dear son. The remaining maid, crossing her arms and sighing heavily, remarked that the situation was difficult. She explained that Yuri had been quietly staying in his room until the previous day, and now that he had seen the Empress, nothing good would come of it. Hearing this, the Empress was filled with fury. She turned to the maid and demanded to know about the letter Yuri had mentioned, asking where it was and why it had never reached her. The maid immediately grew nervous, her worry evident. The Empress, serious and determined this time, threatened that if the maid didn't want to be banished from the castle, she had better bring every letter right away. Terrified by the prospect of banishment, the maid rushed off to comply. Shortly thereafter, boxes upon boxes of letters that Yuri had written over the years were brought into the Empress's room. The girl was astonished as she began to sift through each one. When Yuri was very young, his letters were simple drawings, but as he grew older, he began writing full sentences. Each letter asked about her well-being, expressed his longing to see her, and conveyed his hopes for a response. However, as time passed, Yuri's letters took a sorrowful turn. He wrote that he had given up hope of meeting her because she never replied, and he felt as though she didn't love him at all. Yet, in the final letters, he still held out hope, waiting eagerly for any sign of her affection. As the Empress read these letters, she couldn't hold back her tears. It pained her deeply to realize how much her son had loved her, despite being met with silence. Even as she ignored his letters, he continued to write, always concerned for her. Once she had finished reading, she went to stand outside his room, leaning against the door. Unbeknownst to her, Yuri was standing on the other side, as if they could sense each other's presence, just inches apart yet separated by the door. When one of the maids saw her mistress weeping over the letters, she was overcome with guilt. She realized the extent of her wrongdoing, how she had kept a mother from her son and withheld the letters that had been written in such hope. Unable to contain her emotions, another maid broke down in tears, begging the Empress for forgiveness, apologizing profusely for how things had turned out. The Empress, having regained some composure, looked at the maids and asked who had ordered them to act this way. One of the girls started to reply but hesitated, understanding that any answer would only complicate matters further. The Empress then commanded them to stop crying, adding that they would indeed be punished, but first, she would find out who was behind this cruel act. Realizing the gravity of their actions, the maids understood that they had done wrong, and that punishment awaited them. The Empress turned away, instructing them to take all the letters to her room. They hurried to obey, gathering the boxes, while the Empress headed in the opposite direction from her quarters. As she walked, she reflected on the steps she would need to take to live openly with Yuri. Her thoughts turned to the man who had forced her to abandon her son. She remembered her husband's words when she had first given birth. They had not spoken since he told her she had done what was required of her. Grasping a handful of the letters to her chest, she began to cry once more, overwhelmed by the weight of her situation and the love she felt for her son. The Empress, steeling herself with resolve, knew she had to fight for her son Yuri, no matter the cost. She would ensure that he remained by her side. Determined, she made her way to the Emperor's chambers. When the butler answered her knock, he was startled to find her at the door, but quickly allowed her to enter, assuring her that she was welcome. Inside, she found a handsome, imposing man with jet-black hair and striking ruby eyes, Alexander Klaus, the Emperor of the Iberian Empire, her husband, and Yuri's father. The Emperor, visibly surprised to see her, remarked that it had been a long time since they last met. With a respectful curtsy, the Empress greeted him formally, acknowledging his presence as the light that illuminated their empire. Sensing her serious demeanor, Alexander asked if something had happened in the castle to prompt her visit. The Empress met his gaze directly and confirmed that something indeed had occurred, which necessitated a conversation with him. Alexander stood from his seat and moved to the couch near a small table, inviting her to sit as well. The butler, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped forward, offering to bring them tea and some treats. Though slightly taken aback, the Empress accepted, and soon the butler returned, smiling as he served them tea. The Empress began, carefully choosing her words, and spoke of a door that should not be opened. She asked Alexander if he understood what she was referring to. Alexander glanced briefly at the butler but remained silent. The Empress requested permission to enter this door, which symbolized the most significant barrier separating her from Yuri. In reality, this door represented the strict boundaries set by the palace, accessible only to members of the education department and guarded by strict instructions on who could and could not enter. In her past life, she had never been able to pass through that door, but she realized that if she could secure the Emperor's permission, no one else would have the authority to bar her access. Bowing slightly, she expressed her desire to dismantle all the barriers between her and Yuri and implored Alexander to grant her this request. For a long moment, Alexander stared at her in silence, his expression unreadable. The Empress, sensing his hesitation, decided to press further. She reached into her robe and placed a stack of letters on his desk, explaining that they were from Yuri, addressed to her. She informed him that she had only recently received them and that they had accumulated over a long period. Fixing her gaze on Alexander, she pointed out that someone had clearly ordered these letters to be kept from her, playing cruelly with Yuri's feelings. This, she added, was something she could never forgive and perhaps even seek revenge for. The Emperor remained silent, his attention fixed on her as she spoke. The Empress then appealed to him on a deeply emotional level, reminding him that she was Yuri's birth mother. She expressed her profound sadness at the thought of her son growing up deprived of a mother's love and care, which every child deserves. That was why, from that moment on, she was determined to spend as much time with Yuri as possible, and it was the very reason she had come to him. Alexander continued to stare at her, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. As the silence stretched on, the Empress began to feel anxious. But she steadied herself, clenching her fists, and raised her voice slightly, declaring that she would not leave until she received a positive answer. She reminded him that no matter how hard he tried, or how much he might dislike it, the blood that connected her to Yuri could never be erased, it bound them together for life. As she looked at Alexander, she saw that he was deep in thought, his eyes distant as he contemplated her words. As the Emperor mulled over her words, a long silence ensued. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally looked at his wife and calmly said that she could do whatever she wanted. The Empress was taken aback, unable to believe what she had just heard. To be certain, she asked if he was truly granting her permission. The Emperor, meeting her gaze with unwavering confidence, replied that she had insisted she wouldn't leave without it, so he didn't understand why she was so surprised. Overwhelmed with disbelief and joy, the Empress felt tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't dared to hope for such an outcome, especially given her experiences in her previous life. Choking back her tears, she thanked His Majesty profusely, apologizing for any trouble she had caused. As she turned to leave, she suddenly heard her husband's voice calling her to stop. Confused, she turned back to him, wondering what else he might want. Alexander, now standing, approached her and explained that while he was giving her permission, it came with certain conditions. Her curiosity piqued, she asked what those conditions were. Without answering directly, the Emperor stepped closer and placed a key in her hand, telling her it was her personal key to the door she sought to open. However, he requested that she take the key from his hand herself. This unusual request made the Empress slightly wary. She couldn't fathom what he might be planning, or why he wouldn't simply hand the key to her. But knowing that her efforts were for Yuri's sake, she set aside her concerns, approached him, and took the key from his hand, thanking him once more. The Emperor then handed her a set of additional keys, which she accepted with a bow before turning to leave again. As the Empress exited the room, Alexander glanced down at his hand, feeling a wave of unfamiliar emotions washing over him. He couldn't quite understand where these feelings were coming from, or why they seemed to linger. Determined and now equipped with the necessary keys, the Empress made her way to the door that separated her from Yuri. The guards, as expected, immediately blocked her path, raising their hands in a gesture to stop her. But the Empress, her heart swelling with happiness, smiled and informed them that she had received permission from His Majesty himself, displaying the key he had given her. The guards examined the key carefully, their expressions shifting from concern to resignation. With no other choice, they opened the door for her. As the Empress stepped inside, a profound sense of triumph washed over her. The door that had once been an insurmountable barrier between her and Yuri was now open. She felt a surge of hope, believing that she could now change their shared future for the better. However, after some time had passed, her initial joy began to give way to anxiety. She had searched the castle and even ventured outside, yet she could not find her son. Every person she asked seemed to evade her questions, answering vaguely or pretending not to know her at all. Frustration gnawed at her as the search continued. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Empress spotted Yuri sitting quietly in a nearby street. Relief flooded her, but as she approached, she hesitated, pulling out one of the letters she had been carrying. It was one of Yuri's early letters, where he had drawn pictures and written about a girl who liked flowers, asking his mother what her favorite flowers were and suggesting they pick some together. She quickly made her way to Yuri and sat down across from him. The boy looked up, clearly startled, and asked in disbelief if it was really her. His eyes then shifted to the letter she held, and he inquired if it was truly his letter. The Empress, her voice filled with emotion, apologized for her late response, explaining that she had only just begun reading his letters. She smiled gently and promised that she would go through each letter one by one until they were all answered, ensuring he would never feel neglected again. Turning her attention back to the letter in her hand, she asked about the flowers he had tried to draw, hoping to start their conversation right away. But Yuri, who had been listening quietly, suddenly stood up, his face troubled. He asked for her forgiveness and then abruptly ran away. The Empress was taken aback, her heart sinking as she watched him go. She called after him, pleading for him to stop, but Yuri did not look back. The sight of him running away left her feeling more helpless than ever, her heart aching with the realization of how much pain and confusion still lingered between them. The Empress felt an even deeper pain after Yuri's sudden departure. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had approached him with the intention of reconnecting, yet he had simply run away, leaving her feeling utterly defeated. Her heart ached, knowing that her overwhelming emotions had likely confused and frightened Yuri, causing him to flee. Determined to understand her son better, the Empress picked up another one of his letters. As she read, she was struck by the depth of his feelings for her. Each word revealed the thoughts of a child longing for his mother, and it broke her heart. She realized that in her previous life, she might never have known about these letters, and this knowledge made her all the more resolute to tread carefully. She understood now, more than ever, that children are far more sensitive than adults often realize. They perceive and understand much more than their parents give them credit for. Memories of her own childhood resurfaced, memories of hiding in a corner and crying during her parents' loud arguments. She recalled how those moments of helplessness and confusion had shaped her. With this in mind, she vowed not to let Yuri experience the same pain. She didn't want him to grow up feeling unloved or different. Pushing these thoughts aside, the Empress resolved to take immediate action. She couldn't bridge the emotional gap between her and Yuri by merely imagining what he might be feeling from afar. She needed to be proactive. Throwing open the curtains in her bedroom, she decided that today was the day she would start truly getting to know her son, to ensure she wouldn't hurt him again. Her morning enthusiasm, however, quickly waned when she remembered that she had to check in with her husband before each visit with Yuri. This necessity drained her confidence, but after a moment of gathering her thoughts, she prepared herself to face him. Just as she was about to knock on his door, a voice from behind startled her. It was a woman's voice, one that carried a tone of cold familiarity. The Empress turned to see Miss Adelaide, the Emperor's aunt and the person she despised most. This was the same woman who had taken Yuri from her right after his birth, a figure synonymous with her worst nightmares. Adelaide informed her, with a disconcerting smile, that the Emperor was not present. He had gone to Baltasia to inspect the ladies in the army. Adelaide's remark about the Empress knowing this already, given that she was his wife, was laced with condescension. The Empress had no intention of engaging further with Adelaide, so she turned to leave, saying she would return later. But then, Adelaide offered something unexpected. She said that if the Empress needed the key to the door, she could open it for her. The Empress, stunned, looked at Adelaide in disbelief. This was the same woman who had never allowed her near Yuri, and now she was suddenly offering assistance? Something felt off. Adelaide then pulled out a piece of paper and wrote something on it before handing it to the Empress, instructing her to show the note to the guards to gain entry. The Empress hesitated, wary of Adelaide's sudden change in demeanor, but she accepted the note, thanking her cautiously. However, just as she was about to take the note, Adelaide deliberately dropped it. As the Empress reached down to pick it up, Adelaide stomped on it, her expression turning cold and menacing. She sneered that the Empress had no place interfering with the Crown Prince's upbringing. Adelaide went on to explain that there was a tradition in the imperial family: children were educated by relatives on their father's side. She also reminded the Empress of the Emperor's decree that day when he entrusted all matters of education to her, smirking as she asked if the Empress had conveniently forgotten. The Empress felt a surge of fury at Adelaide's words, but she forced herself to remain calm. As she walked past Adelaide, she couldn't resist shouldering her aside in a rare display of defiance. Adelaide, unfazed, called after her, warning her to watch her actions and not to do anything rash. The Empress bent down to pick up the now crumpled and dirty note from the floor. Despite her anger and frustration, she knew that openly opposing Adelaide, who held significant power within the castle, was not wise, especially for Yuri's sake. She understood that she didn't need to be constantly near Yuri to learn about him; observing him from afar would suffice. And so, that's what she began to do. When he practiced swordsmanship, she stood silently behind him, watching his every move. When he went to study, she found herself in the library, keeping her distance yet always watching. Even at mealtimes, she remained by the window, her eyes on him, ever vigilant. During one of these moments, as she observed him at dinner, Yuri clumsily stabbed a tomato with his fork, and it rolled off his plate onto the floor. A maid quickly retrieved it, but the entire exchange was silent. Yuri apologized quietly, but the maid did not respond, leaving the boy feeling even more isolated. The Empress's heart ached as she watched her son sit in silence, never smiling, his demeanor heavy with loneliness. He didn't behave like a joyful child should. Then, after breakfast one morning, something unexpected happened. Yuri glanced around, making sure no one was watching, and discreetly slipped some fruit into his pocket. Curious, the Empress followed him at a distance, recognizing the path they had walked the previous day. Yuri approached a flower bed, and to her astonishment, a small dog sprang out. Yuri placed the apple on the ground, and the little creature immediately began licking his hand in gratitude. From her hidden vantage point, the Empress saw Yuri take out the food he had saved from his meal and offer it to the dog. As the puppy devoured the apple, Yuri, smiling warmly, asked if it tasted good and assured the dog that it was safe, that no one would harm him. It was the first time the Empress had ever seen Yuri truly smile. His laughter was unrestrained and pure, and it struck her deeply. Here, with this small, secret friend, Yuri found joy. The Empress was moved, realizing that her son had been caring for this hidden companion all along. Overwhelmed, she slipped away, thinking about bringing milk for the pup later. However, no sooner had the Empress left than Miss Adelaide appeared. Yuri's expression shifted immediately from joy to fear as she approached him with a cold, stern demeanor. Without a word, she took a piece of tape from a maid and began her grim task. Though she hadn't spoken, Yuri understood the situation instantly. He rushed to stand between his dog and Adelaide, begging her not to harm the helpless animal, apologizing profusely. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. With a harsh command, Adelaide ordered the maids to dispose of the flea-ridden mutt. The maids obeyed without hesitation, roughly grabbing the puppy by the scruff of its neck. The dog yelped in pain, and its pitiful cries echoed through the garden. One of the maids held Yuri back, restraining him as he desperately tried to free himself, shouting for them to stop. His cries grew louder, filled with panic and sorrow, but no one paid him any heed. In a burst of strength, Yuri broke free and ran to Adelaide, pleading with her to stop, tears streaming down his face. His voice cracked as he begged her to release the dog, telling her that it hurt him too, that the animal didn't deserve such cruelty. But Adelaide had reached her limit. In a moment of fury, she struck him across the face with the whip she carried. The sharp crack of the blow hung in the air as she yelled at him, berating him for soiling himself, reminding him that he was the crown prince and should not waste time with trivial matters like playing with a dirty, flea-infested dog. Her voice was cold, cutting through Yuri's heart as she continued to chastise him. She reminded him, over and over, that his sole duty was to better himself for the good of the country. Her words were harsh, laced with scorn. She told him, in no uncertain terms, that he would be punished for his behavior. Yuri, trying and failing to control his emotions, stood there trembling. His tears threatened to spill, but Adelaide, ever stern, commanded him to pull himself together. A crown prince, she said, could not afford to show weakness. In that moment, Yuri made the heartbreaking decision to obey. Despite the tears welling in his eyes, he swallowed his pain. He rolled up his sleeve, preparing himself for the punishment that was to come. His small, trembling form was a portrait of quiet defiance, but also of deep sorrow. He stood there, waiting, because this was his life, enduring cruelty in silence, even as his heart ached for kindness. Aunt Adelaide had already punished Yuri countless times before, and as she raised her arm to strike again, she wore a satisfied smile. But just as the whip was about to fall, a commanding female voice rang out, ordering her to stop. It was the Empress, who had placed herself between Yuri and Adelaide, shielding him with her own body. Yuri, stunned by his mother's sudden intervention, had not expected her to defend him so boldly. The Empress rose to her feet, her expression fierce, and demanded to know what this all meant. Adelaide, unfazed, crossed her arms and retorted mockingly, questioning whether the Empress thought it wise to challenge her authority. One of the maids then bowed slightly and explained that they had followed Yuri because his behavior had seemed odd. Adelaide and the maid exchanged glances, and the maid, in a harsh tone, revealed that the boy had been feeding a filthy stray puppy. Adelaide's frown deepened as she scolded the Empress, pointing out that Yuri's actions were unbecoming of a crown prince. With a sly smile, she insinuated that his rebellious behavior was due to his mother's bad blood surfacing in him. At this insult, the Empress's restraint snapped, and she began shouting, demanding to know where the innocent puppy had been taken. Adelaide, grinning maliciously, informed her that such disgusting creatures were disposed of immediately. She added that the poor dog had likely already been thrown into the garbage, as it belonged nowhere else. The cruelty of these words only enraged the Empress further, and she screamed at Adelaide, calling her heartless. But Adelaide, cold and composed, jabbed her whip toward the Empress, reminding her that it was not her place to be outraged. She explained that the Emperor had entrusted her with overseeing the Crown Prince's education, and it was her duty to remove all distractions, even if that meant being harsh. Adelaide stepped closer, her voice dripping with condescension, and suggested that the Empress keep herself out of the Empire's affairs. She added sarcastically that if the Empress was going to remain in the palace, she should simply enjoy her luxuries and avoid causing any trouble. It was then that Yuri, trembling and overwhelmed, could no longer bear the conflict. With tears streaming down his face, he turned to his mother and begged her to stop. The Empress was taken aback, looking at her son in disbelief. Through sobs, Yuri apologized, saying that everything was his fault. The Empress's heart broke as she looked at her child, knowing full well that he was blameless, that Adelaide was the true villain in this. She knelt before him, her voice soft yet firm, telling Yuri that he had done nothing wrong and that there was no need to feel guilty. Despite her reassurances, Yuri continued to cry uncontrollably. It was then that Adelaide, ever cruel, interjected. She sneered at Yuri, telling him that his actions had been disgraceful and that the puppy had died because of his childish foolishness. The boy was devastated by her words, apologizing even more fervently. Adelaide coldly dismissed his tears, saying it was beneath a crown prince to weep over a mere stray dog. At this, the Empress reached her limit. She stood up, her voice trembling with fury, and demanded that Adelaide hold her tongue. She could no longer tolerate such vile nonsense. With fire in her eyes, the Empress declared that it was truly pitiful to witness someone like Adelaide, a woman utterly devoid of compassion, daring to speak about what was appropriate for a prince. In that moment, the power dynamics shifted. No longer was the Empress a passive observer, she was a mother, fiercely protective of her son, and she was done with being silent. Adelaide stood momentarily stunned by the Empress's outburst, her initial surprise silencing her. However, she soon turned to the Empress with an incredulous expression, asking what she was implying. But before she could continue, the Empress interrupted, stating firmly that despite Adelaide's refusal to recognize her as Yuri's mother, she would no longer allow her to mistreat him so cruelly. When Adelaide tried to object, the Empress cut her off again, asking if she even understood why Yuri had been crying. Without waiting for a response, she explained that his tears were for the helpless puppy, a clear sign that her son still possessed a pure and kind heart. Fixing Adelaide with a cold stare, she added that, unlike Yuri, Adelaide had lost her heart long ago in her pursuit of empty power and prestige. Adelaide was taken aback, her indignation evident as she called the Empress's words insolent and baseless. But the Empress wasn't finished. She reminded Adelaide of Yuri's letters, the ones he had written to his mother that never reached her. Hearing this, Yuri, standing beside his mother, instinctively covered his ears, terrified by the argument but still listening intently when the letters were mentioned. He looked up at his mother with wide eyes, and she softly assured him that she knew who had hidden them. Adelaide, caught off guard, tried to laugh off the accusation, feigning ignorance and dismissing the Empress's claim as ludicrous. She condescendingly referred to the Empress as the daughter of a baron, accusing her of projecting her father's failures onto others without any real proof. But the Empress calmly stepped closer, taking Adelaide's hand and gently smiling as she mentioned the odd, pungent scent that had accompanied the letters she eventually received. A scent that reeked of Adelaide's heavy perfume. Realizing she had been caught, Adelaide yanked her hand away and shouted, saying it was the first time anyone had dared to show her such disrespect. Rattled, she played her trump card, reminding the Empress that her nephew was none other than Emperor Claus himself. She insinuated that the Empress had no idea what consequences would follow once the Emperor learned of these accusations. But the Empress, unmoved, met Adelaide's threats with a cold, blank stare. Just then, a deep, authoritative voice interrupted the tension, calling Adelaide's name. All eyes turned toward the source, and there stood Emperor Alexander, having arrived with his butler. Adelaide, immediately masking her surprise, put on a cheerful facade and greeted him warmly. The Empress and Yuri, however, were speechless. Neither had expected him to return so soon. As Adelaide hurried toward the emperor, explaining her innocence and claiming that the empress had falsely accused her, the tension thickened. She dramatically expressed her concern for the future of the imperial family, insinuating that the empress was acting irrationally. For a brief moment, the empress recalled the cruel words Adelaide had spoken to her after Yuri's birth, words that had declared her role as a wife over. Alexander remained silent as he observed the situation, his brow furrowed in thought. He let the accusations hang in the air before speaking in a gruff tone. Then, to the shock of everyone present, he ordered Adelaide to leave. His voice was firm, brooking no argument, and the air seemed to still as his words echoed. Though no further explanation was offered, it was clear that the emperor had seen through Adelaide's manipulations. The emperor fixed his stern gaze on Adelaide and commanded her to remove her hands from his son. His words sent a wave of shock through her. Never had she expected such harshness from her beloved nephew. The empress, too, was taken aback, her surprise evident as she stood beside Yuri, unsure whether to believe what she was hearing. Adelaide, her voice trembling, asked Alexander what he meant by his accusation. Without breaking eye contact, he explained that he had ordered an investigation into her methods of educating Yuri. Adelaide, her composure slipping, protested, claiming that her only goal had been to raise the crown prince properly. But Alexander ignored her defense, stating that not only had his son been physically marked by her abuse, but she had also withheld Yuri's letters from his mother, actions far outside the scope of any proper educational duties. Adelaide's hands began to shake, but she attempted to maintain a cold demeanor, denying any malicious intent. Alexander, however, sighed heavily. He confessed that he had tried to honor his late mother's only living relative, but she had betrayed his trust, nearly causing irreparable harm. Her actions, he said, were deserving of death. Hearing this, Adelaide collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by the gravity of his words. Desperate, she bowed her head and begged for forgiveness, but Alexander was unmoved. He turned away from her and began walking off, leaving her groveling in the street. Seeing this, the empress quickly ran after him, calling for him to stop. Alexander paused, and before she could speak, he reminded her that insulting the imperial family carried the severest consequences. Daria, the empress, replied calmly, stating that she understood. However, she argued that death would be too lenient a punishment for Adelaide. Instead, she suggested that Adelaide be stripped of her titles, her noble status revoked, and her life spent in exile, a far more fitting atonement for her crimes than the quick release of death. Alexander considered her words in silence, glancing at Yuri's sorrowful face. After a moment, he reluctantly admitted that while he did not fully agree with her, he would consider her suggestion. With that, he turned and resumed his walk back to the manor, preoccupied with other pressing matters. Left behind, the empress and Yuri stood beside a devastated Adelaide. The fallen woman, sensing her peril, addressed Daria directly. Swearing her loyalty, she pleaded for mercy, promising never to repeat her past transgressions. Daria, however, coldly told her that her pleas were not for her own sake but for Yuri's. She explained that if Adelaide were executed, Yuri might carry the burden of guilt for the rest of his life, even though he was blameless. Looking Adelaide straight in the eye, Daria added that Yuri's heart was more important to her than vengeance. After a long pause, Daria suddenly laughed and asked if Adelaide knew of the Candela region in the north. Adelaide's face paled at the mention of the name. Daria elaborated, explaining that a strict monastery was located there, known for its harsh discipline and icy, desolate environment. It was a place feared by the worst sinners, a fate far more terrifying than death itself. Daria calmly declared that, starting the next day, that monastery would become Adelaide's new home. Adelaide didn't dare argue. She knew her fate was sealed. Bowing her head in defeat, she whispered that she understood. Ice and darkness, this was her new reality. The woman could scarcely believe that she was capable of such actions and felt an immediate urge to beg for forgiveness, but before she could speak, the empress grasped her son's hand and turned away, leaving without a word. Yuri watched his aunt for a moment, noticing the despair etched across her face, and even felt a pang of sympathy for her. Yet, as he clung to his mother's hand, warmth spread through him, and he was reassured that things would soon improve. Shortly after, they returned to the manor and sat together in a quiet room. It was then that Daria, slightly hesitant, brought up the puppy. She apologized for bringing it up during such a tense moment, but Yuri, tears welling up again, assured her it wasn't her fault. He couldn't understand why his mother felt the need to apologize. She had no blame in this situation. The guilt weighed entirely on him. He still believed the puppy had been killed because of his own actions. Just as the thought consumed him, there was a knock at the door. The Empress invited the visitor in, and in ran Johann, a pink-haired man who quickly addressed the Crown Prince. Yuri's eyes widened in disbelief as he saw what Johann held, a cage with a small puppy inside. A smile broke across Johann's face as he announced that he had a gift for Yuri. Overcome with excitement, Yuri could hardly believe his eyes. His beloved puppy, Lulu, was alive. Immediately, he asked Johann how he had managed to save Lulu. Bowing, Johann explained that he had been ordered to keep an eye on Yuri's aunt. When he saw the puppy being taken to the incinerator, he couldn't stand by and let such an innocent creature be harmed. He intervened, sparing the animal. Johann then conveyed a message from the Emperor: if the Crown Prince wished to keep Lulu, the puppy could stay on the castle grounds. Handing the cage to Yuri, Johann added that Lulu should be taken to the vet for a checkup before being fully settled. Daria, who had been sitting quietly behind them, smiled warmly, commenting on how wonderful it was that her son had been given such joy. She expressed her hope that he would no longer carry the burden of guilt, as the puppy was alive and well. Yuri, beaming with happiness, placed the cage gently on the floor and sat beside his dear Lulu.